Okay, we are live. Hello, YouTube. Thank you to anyone who is tuning in live tonight to join us, and extra thanks as well to anyone who catches this on replay later. It is live and available to anyone who wants to chime in. Um, yeah, so I am Josh Gauthier. For those who don't know me, I am a kind of cross-genre writer of fiction and plays, and I have the very great pleasure tonight of welcoming Thomas Ha, accomplished short story writer, and um, author of the Uncertain Suns and Other Stories short story collection, which we're going to be chatting about a bunch tonight. But just the kind of quick introduction. Thomas is a Nebula, Ignite, Locus, and Shirley Jackson Award nominated writer of dark speculative fiction, blending sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and often dealing with topics of family and home, struggles for power, and strained relationships. It's a delightful collection, some wonderful stories out there. But Thomas, thank you for joining today.
Well, thank you for having me on, Josh, and thanks for the kind words about the collection. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm happy to be here to talk about it.
Yeah. So just to kind of preface this, I remember the first story I've read of yours was Window Boy back in Clark's World.
Wow.
I forget even exactly what year that was, but even then, I remember just being struck by the imagery and the storytelling and like so much going on in such a contained story. Um, and after then, just seeing your name kind of pop up in different publications over time. So when I heard Uncertain Suns was coming out, it was very exciting to know that there was going to be a complete collection. So to start us off, just to tell us a little bit about the journey to get to this point. What has writing looked like for you? What led up to this collection coming out in print for the world to see?
Yeah, sure. So, wow, the journey to come to this point. Let's see, where do I start? I was born in, no, I don't know. I like a lot of writers wrote a lot throughout most of my life here and there. I kind of thought maybe I would one day like to write more seriously, but the opportunity never really arose. I went on to become a lawyer, and I was doing that in New York for a while, and then later in LA for a while, for a number of years, until I had to pivot a little bit, and I became a stay-at-home parent to our kids, our three young kids, which is the best decision I've ever made, and it's very rewarding, and I'm happy I did it. But it was around that time that the COVID-19 lockdowns happened. So what was supposed to be, I think, kind of an emergency stopgap, me stepping in to do this thing ended up being a little bit more permanent because, I don't know when people are going to watch this YouTube video, but everyone, you obviously remember what a destabilizing event that was, and there wasn't a lot of other options on the table. So while I was there with my kids is when I decided to go back a little bit and pick up the pen and think about the things that I loved about fiction and short fiction in particular, which I liked a lot in high school and college when I was younger, but kind of let it drop because life happens and you do other things. But I got back into it again and really started to make a go of it. And I know you know this, Josh, as a fellow writer, but maybe for those listening who might not know, typically what it involves is, you sit there and you let these ideas fester and you write them down, and then you go and you look at magazines and you see who is taking what based on their guidelines, what their word counts are, what genres, and then you submit, and then you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and then you get a rejection and you get another rejection, and then you do that again and again and again until eventually you sell something. And the goal is just to build a body of work over time. And so that's what I did, starting out at smaller magazines, token markets. That's a tier where they pay you a small kind of honorarium or flat fee. Then moving on to semi-professional, which is, at least 1 cent a word, up into about 7 cents, and then professional magazines, about 8 cents a word. And that's basically it. I just did that over and over and over and over again. And before I knew it, eventually I had sort of a critical mass or enough things put together where I could look at it and I thought, I do think there's something here. There's maybe something that's cohering. Could I put this together into something bigger? And that's pretty much where we are today. This is, the point where we're at where I ended up doing Uncertain Suns, and that came out with Undertow Publications just last month. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I'm very happy with how it turned out, and I'm glad to have made it to this point.
Yeah, and I like the way you phrase it, of working up through that markets, because so many writers I know, like that's the journey. It's just kind of starting out doing it for you, and then you find the few people that like it, and the goal obviously is to kind of keep branching out and encountering more readers who just resonate with what you have to say. Um,
That's exactly right. And actually, I should say two things in response to that. One, building readership is so key, and that's what I've been trying to work on for years, is finding those people who vibe with what I do, and that's so critical. And then two, I realized the way I did phrase it, it sounded like working my way up to pro markets. But honestly, the audiences in all of the magazines are so good and so varied that it's not like you ever graduate and you go like, oh, I'm a professional now. I'll never go back down there. It's like, no, 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 no. Semi-pro magazines do some of the best work, I think, that's out there, depending on the editor and their vision. Same thing with token markets. So I'm constantly bouncing around, through all of them whenever I can. So I just wanted to say that just to cover my butt, just in case, one of my editors is listening and they're like, "Oh, how dare he? He thinks he's too good." That's not the case at all.
yeah,
Uh,
no, definitely. Yeah, some of the indie stuff being done by publishers, by writers at the really small scale is incredible, groundbreaking work. And it's fun to see the full spectrum of just what people are diving into.
yeah, yeah, and they have the freedom to do that too at some of the other magazines because they have their own audience that likes what they like, and they can go direct to them. So it really is. It's kind of like the Wild West out there. You really just are like, you don't know what territory you're in, and you just got to try different things, and you don't know what's going to work. So you just try whatever, and eventually, like I said, things come together, hopefully.
Yeah, and that taking risks, like it leads to really exciting places at times. So,
Yeah.
um, and spinning right off of that, actually, I don't want to ask the question that all writers get, like, where do your ideas come from? Because
Mm.
it's always impossible for us to actually answer. But speaking kind of broadly, just as a primarily short story writer, kind of what does that process look like? Because you called it like an idea festering and then taking shape. Um, but I'm sure it varies from story to story, but do you have a couple like examples of how a story kind of grew or kind of a dedicated process that you like to use when you have a new idea?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. It really does vary, and some of them are a lot easier than others, and some of them are like pulling teeth. But I do think, there is the conception stage, and without going into that cliche territory or well-trodden territory about like where it all comes from, for someone like me, and I think this is common for a lot of people who have obviously day jobs, which is most of us. You don't have a lot of time. Like the actual sitting down and writing time is so limited. And at first, that I struggled with that. My kids are very young and it's just chaos all the time. But I've come to realize that a lot of that is a really good filter. And, because ideas are a dime a dozen, they're so cheap. Fellow writers, we all know this. You can think of all kinds of things like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if this or that, or you mash this or that? And it all just flits along the surface. There are all these ideas, and some of them are really weak and they're just not worth the time. But when your time is limited and you've got to do other things, there is a certain, for me at least, a pressure that builds up around the ideas that I do think are more important. There's a little bit more urgency to the things that ultimately do break through. And I think, having other responsibilities and things that take you away from writing is actually a very good and healthy thing because then when you sit down and you have that limited writing window, the stuff you're writing actually really matters to you, I think, to get to that point. So that's conception. And then, the middle stage, the actual writing of it, for me, I'm just a very linear person. So I know, I hear writers do craft talk and shop talk all the time. Some people are really good at doing the non-linear thing or like putting up a board with what they need and they can do other scenes. I have to go at the start and I work the intro a million times and then I go a certain point and I hit a snag and then I got to start over. And I go a certain point, hit a snag and start over. And I basically just comb in that way over and over, getting further and further until the end. And I can't do it any other way. It has to be like I know where each piece falls before I reach the ending. And then finally, I think is the last stage, which is, I guess, editing. But really, for me, it's a conceptual thing, which is just letting go and knowing when to stop. And I think that's actually one of the hardest things to know. And the thing that I struggled to learn the first 3 or 4, 2 or 3 years, maybe because I think there's an impulse for me, and I think a lot of people, I've heard this from others as well, to try to seek perfectionism. Like you're so anxious about getting published that you want this one shot to be a life changer. Like you want this to knock people flat, and you want it to be like a grand symphony that fulfills a whole bunch of stuff, a banger. What people say a lot of times. But the problem with that is not all short stories are bangers, and they're not supposed to be. And I think one of the big things I had to learn, especially as I read more broadly and read lots of collections in particular, is that when you look at authors and their body of work, not everything's a banger, and not everything's supposed to be. Some are, not symphonies, they're like weird little quartets or pop covers or, something that makes you feel a certain way, light, whatever. I don't know music clearly. I don't know where to go other than symphony. I'm just like throwing in music words. But you get what I mean. There are different
Yeah.
songs, and not everyone is like this life-altering big thing. So instead of sitting there and trying to like put a hat on a hat on a hat and like layer things on and be like, oh, do I have the perfect character, setting, theme, pacing? Does it all link up in just the right way? I think what I had to learn to do was just know when the idea I had was on the paper.
Hmm.
And Gene Wolfe is an author I really admire. And he said, I think in one of his interviews I read recently, I love this phrase. He said, in your apprentice years, you have to learn how to let stories roll down your arm. And by that, I think he meant that, the idea that you conceive just gets on the paper. That's the idea, and then it's done. And
Hmm.
you learn to just put it out in the world, submit it to the magazines or whatever. And if it gets bought, great. If it doesn't get bought, maybe you rework it if you get a lot of feedback. But that's really the last stage is like, is this done? Is this the idea I set out to write? And if it is, just put it out the door, out of your mind, and then move on. Do something else.
Yeah. I forget where I heard it first, but it really helped me when someone described it as like a story is never done, but you reach a point where you're done with it.
Yeah, maybe that's it. That's that.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to what you're saying, but yeah, like I know I could sit there and tinker with word choice like forever.
Right.
But yeah, at a certain point, like what you have to say is there. And it's funny too hearing you talk about process. I'm also very linear and cannot jump through a story.
Yeah.
Um, do you tend to write kind of exploratory, or do you kind of know what the heart of a story is by the time you're sitting down with it?
Yeah, the old plotter versus pantser, right? Maybe it was my attorney training and like I was a history major before. I started out as a very heavy planner and outliner where I knew every piece that I wanted before I sat down, and that was the way I did it. But over time, more and more, I've just been more exploratory. I have the ideas. I usually know where it's going to go, with a few exceptions, but halfway through, three-quarters of the way through, almost every time, there's a turn, and maybe it's minor, a few degrees, and it's not huge, but there's something I don't expect and takes it away that I don't uh, anticipate when I sit down initially. And that always makes it better, almost always. And I try to follow that. Again, despite being I think of myself as very cerebral and rational and plannerly, but I think it's so much of a vibe thing and an energy thing. And I've become very much new age hippie, like you go where the energy is. And if your attention is here for whatever reason, like you're really into this character or you're really into this setting, you're like, no, there's something here. I now follow that all the way. I don't know about you, but what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I've definitely had those moments where yeah, something clicks. For me, it's often thematic where I will realize something kind of underlying in a story partway through.
Mm,
I'm actually this has been going on and off the shelf for a while, but I'm working on a novel manuscript and
mm,
I was 30,000 words into it, I think, before I realized like what it was about. kind of like the heart of it.
Right.
And that opened up a lot, in kind of understanding where to go and how to connect pieces and stuff like that. But I got quite a ways in before that really clicked of kind of what the characters were actually going through.
Right.
And I think I just needed to spend time with it, like before I was able to get there. But I do like how you talked about like letting the ideas percolate even before you get to the computer as well. I think that's one of the things that's hard to explain about being a writer or probably a creative in lots of forms to people who don't do it
Yeah.
is like how much is kind of thinking and you're driving the car or you're cooking or whatever and like still processing all those pieces until they kind of take shape intentionally but on their own all at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Just a lot of subconscious processing all the time, always working in some way, even if you're not actively, at the keyboard, for sure.
Yeah. So to divert and pitch this a little bit to our listeners, this collection was, as they say nowadays, no skips. Like I truly loved everything in here cover to cover.
Oh, thanks.
Um, but one of the things that I think is really fun, and other people have pointed this out as well, is that it's hard to put you like in a genre.
Mm,
Because there's sci-fi, there's horror, there's weird fiction, there's fantasy. And I think that nowadays, particularly going back to like the idea of some of the literary markets that are out there, a lot of people are playing with genre in short form and kind of pushing those boundaries and blurring lines. As you're like sitting down to write, do you think about genre at all? Is that kind of in the equation, or do you just kind of write the story that wants to be written and let genre sort itself out later?
yeah, so I have my like writerly official answer, which I know is like the literary answer, which is, oh yes, like the story is the story. Of course, I don't think about genre. I do what I do. I've said that. I shouldn't use that voice. I use that answer quite a bit. I focus on the characters. I focus on the story I want to tell. But I mean, it's a little bit of a lie, or it's an extreme to say that like I am totally not paying attention to where the genre lines typically are, because part of the fun is upending some of those expectations a little bit. And some of the stories, uh, not all of them in this book, but some of them in this book, are very purposeful in the way they make you think you are in one kind of setting and you end up in another, or have a bunch of fantastical dark fantasy type elements, but then there's a robot that shows up, like things like that.
Mhm.
I am aware to some degree of like the mode I am putting someone in before I then tug at the rug underneath their feet a little bit, and never a full rug pull, but like I want them to feel the shakiness. So, I mean, the truth of the matter is like I think at the end of the day, the categorization that the story ultimately gets put in is not a writer's responsibility. And I
Yeah.
will never come out and be like, yeah, it is only this or that. It's for editors who buy it, or marketers, or whoever, readers themselves. They decide what it feels like for them. I think that I feel strongly about. But in the writing process, like I do think, despite everything I've said in other interviews, like I have to pay attention to some degree to where other people put the fences, because that's how you know where to mess with things.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it was the fairgrounds in particular. It was one of the interesting ones where that twist kind of caught me off guard for what genre we were working in. Because it starts out very just small family, and you're still getting a sense of kind of the time and the place of it. And then as the story unfolds, you discover a lot more details about this world. Um,
Yeah, and that's one. I mean, I don't think this is spoiling too much to say in detail, because I'm not going to give away any plot points, but like, it does start. I think anyone who reads that one in particular, like everyone who reads a carnival story, there's no getting away from this. Like, you can't run away from it. People are going to think of Bradbury. They're going to think of Something Wicked This Way Comes. It's just in the lexicon. It's a
mhm,
touchstone almost every spec fic writer has. So you hear carnival, you see a boy, you're expecting something creepy, sinister, horror, dark fantasy. And then there's a flip when you see what's within it, and it's more sci-fi and it's retro futuristic, whatever, however you want to categorize it, more technology driven. And then there's another flip again where there's something within that is not within that category either. So yeah, I think when I talked that piece over with the editor, Morris Allen at Metaphorosis magazine, there were inflection points where it's like, you have to think about what a reader might feel when they're going through it. You can't just be selfish or focused on yourself. It's got to be like, well, up until this point, you're going to have this feeling, and then it's going to turn, and then this point, it's going to turn. I do feel like you got to be cognizant of the audience.
Yeah, and that's another piece of advice that I've heard a few different times. Kind of what you were saying about like being aware of the tradition that you're writing in.
Mm.
Like even if you're not setting out to write sci-fi strictly or whatever, like you've referenced, there's a long history of people who are doing this sort of work. And
Yeah,
so you don't want to come in and think that you've invented Ray Bradbury for the first time.
right.
Because yeah, the people have all these kind of frames of reference that are important to recognize and either kind of uphold or subvert or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a tricky, it's a fine line too. And we're maybe straying from the point a little bit, but I think it's worth saying since we're just talking shop anyway. You want to be cognizant of what people expect because of the traditions, like you said. The one thing you don't want to do is please them too much. Like you're not out to do it, and the story does not exist to make them necessarily, because you don't know what's going to please everybody, obviously. And so you don't want to, like, you can feel it as a reader, I think, when a writer is pandering or is trying to get you to feel overly sentimental or this or that. So you really got to focus on what the story is while at the same time having this awareness of the genre you're playing and the history that you're playing in. So you're not, I don't know, retreading ground, or if you are going to do a rug pull, you're doing it on purpose in a very specific way, not inadvertently just for your own kicks. Because I think that pisses people off, or it makes it less enjoyable for them if they feel like you're doing it haphazardly as opposed to with a purpose.
Definitely, yeah. I'm gonna jump out of order of our questions a little bit because I like this
Go
exact
for
kind
it.
of train of discussion.
Yeah.
You've referenced a couple writers, but there's two parts to this. Like, who are some of the other kind of influences that you've drawn from? And out of that, like, do you feel like Uncertain Suns is kind of in conversation with any other kind of past authors or other works that have been influential?
Yeah, I'm gonna buy myself some time and dodge the harder part of that by
Fair.
going with the easier granular part. Like I do think there are individual stories where I am thinking of specific authors when I write them. So I've already invoked Gene Wolfe. I do this, it's so annoying. Every Gene Wolfe fan, like they just have to talk about him and they just will not shut up about him. And I don't want to be that guy, but I just end up doing it for these interviews because he's so easy to talk about because he does these things so well. His short
Mhm.
fiction is always very good at both layering ideas and twisting expectations. So there are a lot of stories like Window Boy or Sweet Baby, any number of the stories in here. Like I feel the influence of his like hand in this, or I was thinking about him at the time. And then there are other authors like Brian Evanson, who's, a very great weird fiction, like one of the best, if not the best, living weird fiction writer out there, in my opinion. His influence is in there. Octavia E. Butler is in some of these stories, probably in ways that people wouldn't guess. Cretins, in particular, the second story about, a debilitating condition was very heavily influenced by one of her short stories, and I'm blanking on the title. I always mess it up. It's like the evening, the morning, and the night, or it's some combination of that. But it's another story about a debilitating condition that I thought was really well told. So there's like a one for one for a lot of these authors. William Hope Hodgson, who does weird fiction, House on the Borderland, and a lot of the imagery in that bleeds into House Traveler and a number of other stories, Borges, Murakami, and then maybe one last big one, especially for the title story, Uncertain Suns, is the author Michael Shea, who is a weird fiction author who wrote he wrote some dark fantasy and sword and sorcery, and he wrote some Lovecraftian short fiction, but he has this really uncanny ability to describe gross, disgusting, terrifying monsters in a way that makes them sound cancerous. Like his use of language is so specific and he makes them sound like these tumorous, disgusting things. And that was a huge influence on the ecosystem in the final story where everything is like running rampant and all these creatures have these dependencies with each other. There's this really great story he wrote called Polyphemus, that is about this alien creature, this group of scientists trying to survive a terrible situation where they're stuck with this ecosystem of alien creatures, and that has a huge influence on that. So it's a really, really long way of saying it's not like an overarching conversation in this collection with any one of these authors, but as I was building these stories out over the course of, 6 years, there are a lot of individual like reverberations from everyone I was reading at the time. Like I can go back and I read it and I go, oh yeah, that was my Wolf phase, or that was my Evanson phase, or that was this or that. And then it ends up kind of coalescing around something new. That's the idea or the goal is that it builds into something else.
Yeah, yeah, and I know in some of the discussion I've seen of this collection, people are invoking like Bradbury and some many of the authors you mentioned as well. And yeah, not always in like direct sequels or follow-ups necessarily, but a lot of those kind of the influences and the themes carried on obviously into kind of a new age and dealing with new types of technology and new world situations and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, can I confess something to you, by the way? I've
Yeah,
never said
please.
this before, but I might as well. Bradbury gets invoked quite a bit with this collection, and I actually don't know. I haven't read a ton of Bradbury. I like politely, I'm like, oh wow, that's so cool. But like, other than the Fairgrounds, where I was like very specifically, I was like, there's no way you can avoid Bradbury. This is Bradbury. This is going to influence it. And I know that story, so I'm going to lean into it. But all the rest, like people are like, oh, have you read this short story? Have you read that? And like, I'm sorry, like I'm just not as familiar. I know that's like heresy for short fiction, spec fiction. Like you're supposed to have been like boned up on his work, but man, I always have to just kind of like be like, oh wow, I do what I can, but that's not an area I'm not super fleshed out in.
Yeah. No, I love it. I'll match your confession. I also have not read nearly as much Bradbury as I probably could have by this point. So,
Yeah, yeah. Like I've read like October Country and some of the Martian stories, but that not a ton, not a ton. He's got a rabid fan base though, I'll tell you that.
he does. Yeah, definitely one of those kind of giants in the field whose name comes up over and again. It's funny now that you say it that way, like the either cultural things that seep in or the maybe it's just the way that we find as humans our way to kind of similar topics and stories, even without necessarily being directly influenced by a specific person who has done it before.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree. When a lot of these times these Bradbury fans say these things, they point out a story and I'll go and I'll read it and I'll go, oh yeah, I see where they got that. Yeah, for sure. I didn't get it from there, but like there are only so many ways you can write about a nuclear family undergoing some sort of dark speculative scenario. And there's only so many dots you can draw and you go like, okay, this is one of the biggest cultural touchstones we have. Of course it's Bradbury, right? And you go,
Yeah,
oh, I see how you got there. For sure.
yeah.
For sure.
It's the whole idea. Like there are no new stories, but there's always brand new ways to tell them.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and so I think kind of spinning off from that, with this collection, within the book, did you kind of conceive of these stories in relation to each other? Um, Either coming out as a collection or like recurring kind of images and elements in them? Or was each one kind of its own thing and then the collection came later?
It was a bit of a combination. So I give this away in the acknowledgments. Like I do say there are three stories that are definitely connected. Like when I was starting to build the collection, I knew these three stories were going to be the main through line. So House Traveler, The Sword, and Uncertain Suns, sort of a part one, part two, part three. And I wanted them to sum up a lot of the themes I thought I was grappling with over the years in a lot of different short stories. And I do think there are indirect connections and echoes in the other stories. There's thematic repetition in a lot of things. And as I was going, even before I had the idea for this collection, I did have a sense like, oh, maybe this monster here is kind of like that monster there, or I can see how these connections echo. But I really wanted to avoid the wikification, the MCU strict continuity effect where you have the impulse or the pressure as a reader to try to slot things in a very specific way. So part of the reason why in the acknowledgments I was like, listen, I'll just be straight up about these three and just say if you see echoes elsewhere, that's fine, but these three are definitely connected, is I didn't want people to go nuts, like trying to draw things back and forth. Like 20 years from here, I think this happened. And then 30 years from here, this degradation, this fall to society happened. It's not quite like that. I really do want the stories to stand alone. And if there is any echo, a lot of it is thematic. I wanted this to feel like more of an old school classic. I'm gonna say Bradbury collection, but like one of those, like an
Mhm.
October Country, for example, where you pick it up and it's a grab bag, and it's got a different feel, and maybe you feel some repetition, but you can take each thing as a standalone. That's really like my hope is that people can pick it up and read each story without feeling like they have to put it all together if they don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that. And th that was very much the experience I had in reading it as well. Because yeah, thematically there are a lot of through lines that kind of run through many of the stories. But I remember the first few in there lean kind of heavily on the apocalyptic themes, kind of sci-fi elements. But then you jump to some of these other that are very fantasy forward, or even the one we were talking about earlier about the debilitating like the sleep condition. On the surface have a very different feel to them, and are kind of operating in a different way, but then are still exploring like many of the same things. So it's interesting to build a collection that has so much diversity in it, but still feels cohesive by the time you're done.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. That's what I hope to have done. And it was a process. And maybe since we're bouncing around and just going wherever the conversation takes us. I mean, that was a real thing I struggled with in placing the stories within like when I had the final manuscript because it started out very different. It was much longer, and I had a very academic idea of what I wanted to do, and it was broken up into different sections and different arcs. But I realized in order for it to work and to be like a fun reading experience, I needed palette cleansers in there. I needed changes of tone that weren't all just sort of like these totally discombobulated, disorienting, emotionally, heavy story after story after story. There had to be some variation in order
Mhm.
to be able to carry certain readers through. I mean, some people love that. Some people love weird. I can read a whole collection of downers. I don't need variation, but the hope is that this introduces some new readers to stuff as well. So there are stories like, Where the Old Neighbors Go. That was one of my oldest stories, and it's much more conventional in its structure. And there's like a beginning, middle, and end. There's banter, there's triumph, there's a twist.
Mhm.
And some people really gravitate towards that. They're like two extremes, right? There are people who like the convention, and then there are people who really like the weird and the like just off kilter. And uh, I really wanted to hopefully get at both of those a little bit. So just had to switch it up, I think. And I'm happy with how it turned out.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, based on the reception, I think you've found people that are definitely meshing with what you've done with the book. So,
Fingers
uh,
crossed. Knock on wood. Still early days. We don't know.
it is, yeah. Um, but okay, so d diving into the stories themselves a little bit more. The weirdness and the ambiguity, I think, serves the short form in general very well, and it's definitely something that you kind of play with over the course of this. But for me as a reader, there's all these shades of like AI, technology in general, climate. The stories end up feeling very relevant. Not necessarily in a like direct way, but echoes of our current times kind of all throughout. Um, how do you kind of think about like art that is engaging with the moment when it's created for you? Is it kind of like an outlet for some of these things, as those ideas are taking form?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And the one I wanted to talk about the most and I'm most interested in, and the one I'm least prepared for. Like everything that it's about to come out of my mouth is going to be just just a mess because I've been struggling with trying to think about what I think about this, and I don't know what I think about this. So it's not going to be well articulated. Sorry.
No,
But
please.
yeah, no. But I mean, I do think, let's see, here's where I start with that. From my perspective, I think message driven writing and trying to be relevant is doomed to fail in short fiction. I think you cannot do it. I mean, people try and people pull it off, but for someone like me, that's a safe way to caveat it. For someone like me, doesn't work. I think the second you try to say, here is a story about X issue, Y politician, whatever, you have put up walls in people's minds. They already know what they think. They don't want you to tell them what they think. And you would be better off served going on Blue Sky and ranting about it in short form and getting likes for it immediately and getting that rush, if that's what you want to do, and communicating your message that way, or doing a political rally or doing a speech. There are other mediums where that's better suited to me, for me.
Mhm.
People can disagree, and maybe other people will disagree. I I think for short fiction, you have to go internally. And you know, you brought up a bunch of current topics like AI, environment, politics, whatever else. And I care about these things very deeply. I think if you follow me on social media or whatever, I can't avoid at least like opening my mouth and saying something stupid at some point about something or reposting whatever because everything's really charged right now. I think most people feel that way. But for my stories, I think what's more productive is to think about the things that really bother you internally, your anxieties, your fears, your concerns, and approach it with as much honesty and intensity as you can and not talk about it, or at least not talk about it directly. You build something around it. You build an analogy or a metaphor or a story or a world. And I think the closer that that metaphor or analogy is to what you actually want to say, usually the less satisfying uh, the story ends up being. That's a side topic. I don't know why, but for me at least, if I want to talk about depression and I make a magical metaphor for depression and I put in a story, it doesn't work, at least for me. I think it's got to be something else. I think you got to disambiguate it. You got to mix it up and load it with archetype and symbol and a bunch of things and let it play and let it work out and then write the story. And then what happens is someone reads the story and they don't get a message from you. It's not something external that you communicate that they take in. No, no, no. You tell the story and something internal in them gets received and goes off like a bomb in their brain. And they have a whole bunch of associations and life experiences and reactions and imagery in their head. And it may be exactly the same as what you thought, or it might be totally different. It could be a totally different wavelength and it might not match what you thought at all. But the hope is that if you come at it with that honesty and intensity, that reverberation, whatever it is, sets off an equal reverberation in them, whatever that is. That is, and this is, I have no good metaphor for this. I don't know like radio waves enough or sound waves enough to be able to build an analogy, but whatever that new age energy BS imagery I'm painting is, I think that is how stories work. And it is way more powerful than, for example, saying like, well, I hate AI, so I want to make an AI story. So here's my AI story. I think that's gonna bomb, or at least it will feel like a bomb in my head. That's a safer way to say it. For me as a writer, it is not satisfying. I think this other process of going into yourself and speaking to whatever that thing is and then it's setting off the reaction, that process is way more rewarding and way cooler because then when they have that reaction and they come to you and they want to tell you what they thought and people want to share, sometimes it's cool when the reaction is the same because you're like, oh my God, you read my mind. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Or it's different, but it's just as real and just as true, and it makes just as much sense. You go, oh, holy crap! Like that's exactly right. That could be true. I was thinking of some of those things. I do have some of those experiences as well, and it's just this back and forth that is really addictive and interesting to me.
Hmm.
So I know that was really, really long, and I should let you react to that. But at the end of the day, my point is like it's not a grabbing something external, sending something external. It's really, really as much as internal a thing as you can make it for me.
Yeah,
Does that make any sense?
it did. No, I totally agree, and I think you summed that up really well. Because I know I've heard other people talk about like message stories, and the consensus I've heard at times, at least, because obviously people do write them, and that's valid. But is that they're always kind of bound to the time and, like you said, to the audience that they're written for.
Right.
And I think the stories and the art that become most enduring are those like the really messy human ones.
Hmm.
And so they grapple with all this other stuff, but like they're always rooted in just kind of who we are as people and the things we're feeling and fears and insecurities and joys and all that stuff. And then that overflows into technology or whatever the case may be. But like we go back to Shakespeare, he's still around because like there are human things in there that are still resonating with people,
Right.
up through Bradbury, and the people we're still talking about, like, we're decades or centuries removed from them, but it still hits at something that we care about.
Definitely. Absolutely. Yep.
So yeah, so no, I love your explanation, and it's fun kind of just hearing that thought.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it. I'll shorten it and I'll come up with something more pithy like 10 years from now. It'll take a
Yeah.
while. Yeah.
But I mean, I think even going back to that question of like where do the ideas come from, is it's all of that. Like we're taking who we are, the world we live in, and then you're just like chipping off pieces of all that and putting it into a story that is then coherent, but it comes from so many places all at once.
Yeah. Yep, for sure.
I'll get back to my questions in a second, but we've got a couple folks in the chat actually,
Oh,
who are
cool.
just kind of chiming in. Brandy also just wanted to confirm that she loved every story in the collection and said that that's
Oh,
rare for her for a short story collection.
thank you. That I really appreciate that. I was saying to Josh offline before we hopped on, you never know if anyone's going to read your short stories or anything. So if they read it and they react well, it's like the best feeling. So I really thank you for letting me know.
And then we've got another question as well, wondering, you mentioned like having all these ideas and then trying to pick out like the best ones to spend time with. And they're wondering, how do you know which one actually has promise for the page? Like, how do you select which one to sit down with?
My answer would have been different like 5 years ago, and it would have been more cerebral. That's like the theme, I think, of what I keep going back to tonight. But I think it's very, very much a gut thing. And for me, it just doesn't go away. It becomes like an obsession. It feels like, again, like I think I said pressure. I think there's a pressure, like you gotta get it out. And there are certain things that will just continue to bother you until you exorcise them like demons and get them out of you. And there are some stories too. Some of them are bad. Like I think a lot of writers will admit to this is like sometimes you just got to get it out of your system because unless you purge it and like see how it plays out and put it on the page, it's just gonna rattle around in there endlessly. So it doesn't always turn into like the best thing that you possibly could have done, but there's something there. Like the fact that you couldn't let it go, it goes back to that honesty, intensity, vibrational thing. Like it meant something to you if you couldn't let it go. And it kept coming up when you were doing your housework or dropping off your kids or whatever it is. So my short answer is like it's got to bother you. And that's how I know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny too. Even for the ones that like don't end up being good at once you've gotten them out. I feel
Yeah.
like I've had stories or ideas that like 90% of it failed, but there's some 10% that like finds its way into something even years later.
Right.
But like that's maybe the part that did want to kind of stick around and had the most importance, and then it finds its way into an entirely different place later on.
Yeah, yeah, you can always cannibalize those bits, and this is going to bleed into some other questions I'm sure that we have later, but just broadly with short fiction in general, that's another reason not to be super precious and let the idea play out is that you get to iterate. That's one of the fun things about short fiction is you can constantly go back and cannibalize things or play it out again or play it out almost exactly identically but change one or two factors. Like that's really something that this form excels at that you cannot do with a novel or something that takes a bigger time span and chunk of your life. It just doesn't work as rapidly. But with short fiction, you can. So you might as well take that idea that has the pressure, put it out there, and then see if it's good or not. And I know I'm going on long, but the last idea with that is too, you know this. I mean, you don't know what's good or bad. You don't
Mhm.
actually know. There are times where, like, I thought a story was not the best it could have been or whatever, but it has meaning to someone sometimes in a very deep way. And you go, maybe I wasn't thinking about it the right way. So you just got to try it all sometimes.
Some of the stuff I've had that has had the best reception is not the things I anticipated going over well. It's really
Yeah.
funny. Like, I think part of it is being so close to some of the work. Like, we're messing through it all the time until it gets to a finished place.
Hmm.
And then when it lands in front of an audience, like some piece of that will sometimes click in a very unexpected way, and it is just, it's exciting to see people respond to something that you're maybe tired of looking at by that point.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, okay, there are a couple other questions I do want to get to while we have time. You write a lot of children into these stories as well. And that's, I know, something that can be tricky for writers is to write children convincingly and compellingly in adult fiction. How do you kind of go about getting into that headspace, that voice, that thought process, for making children not only major characters, but POV characters so frequently?
Mm. Um, I think they are great POV characters to use. Well, first of all, I think how do I get into the voice or how do I know what to do with kids? I think part of that is just that's what dominates my life on a day-to-day basis. Probably why it ends up recurring is I'm in a family setting. That is my quote unquote day job. I mean, I takes up all of my time and it's rewarding and it's great, but oh boy, is it there's never a dull moment. There's always something happening. And when that's the case and you're in the thick of it, it's one of those write what you know type situations where probably that's why it's the first thing that pops in my head. So there's that in the background. But from like a craft perspective, I think child characters, yeah, it's hard to nail the voice. Yeah, it can be done very clumsily uh, often. But the strengths or the positives to me are that one, especially if you're doing dark speculative fiction or that sort of thing, children are great characters of moral clarity sometimes. They see things very starkly and have a sense of morality. Maybe it's not fully formed, but a very simplistic idea of morality that can be very useful or a tool in a type of story. So, like a window boy type story, for example, at least at the beginning, it's very tightly told from the perspective of Jakey and his clear struggle or sense that there are people, the window boy or people outside, that he thinks ought to be helped. They ought to be fed. They ought to be engaged with. Like he has a very simplistic idea of like, this is the way it should be. And that's the way kids are. I mean, if you ever sit down and try to talk to them about, oh boy, I mean, my oldest is now getting at the age where he's thinking about bigger things and the questions are getting a lot harder to answer. And you'll see like kids are like, well, why is that? I mean, why would you do that? Why would we do that? Like, that's wrong. And you go, yeah, I mean, yes, it is wrong, but, and then as the adult, you fill in the rest. So kids are a device, I think, to cut through some things sometimes. But then on the other end too, and this is, I think, my last point on this topic, is that kids are a great twist on things or a great disorienting device because they also take a lot for granted. So in a lot of these weird stories where like the world is wrong, kids are funny POV characters because there is so much they just accept. Like again, going back to Jakey, the flip side of a Jakey who has moral clarity, he also does not question the strangeness of grackles or boar cats or raccoon tails or all these things that he's talking about. That's just the way the world is. There's just a season where things are, bad outside and things are not going well if you're in balloon season, for example, and there's a different family. But, kids just talk about it as if it's a thing. And that is, for me, a very interesting device that sets readers off in a totally different way. They get off kilter because they're like, why aren't they freaking out? Or why isn't the kid doing this or that? The casualness with which kids approach things sometimes is a great tool
Hmm.
for stories like that.
Yeah, and I know for something like Window Boy, it is so interesting. I don't want to call it an unreliable narrator, because they aren't necessarily like misleading the audience, but a not fully informed narrator makes for a very interesting perspective as you're starting to like see more of the world and kind of get glimpses into what else is going on there.
You could say unreliable. Kids are unreliable. They don't
Yeah,
know. I asked my kid what happened at school, and he's like, like I think this, and then you find out it's totally different. Now they're unreliable.
that's
They
fair.
don't know.
And then the one other kind of thematic question I definitely wanted to touch on,
Hmm.
and it's related to kids, but there's this idea of like generational responsibility that
Hmm.
kind of runs through a lot. A lot of it's like parents and children. Balloon Season has some of that, but Uncertain Suns in particular, the title story, has that very heavily in there.
Right.
Is that something that you kind of had very early on, or is that one of those themes that's kind of found its way into stories as you were writing them?
I think that is something I had very, very early on. Even before the collection, I think that is something I wanted to build too. So when I was putting the collection together, that was the final piece that actually wasn't done when I pitched the manuscript. And I had to kind of like quickly put it together because I talked to the editor, Michael Kelly at Undertow, about the manuscript and asked if I could pitch it to him, and he said sure. So then I had to go and at least flesh this idea out. And it came very quickly. It was, I mean, it had been baking for a long time, years really, different versions of it. And it just flowed out very quickly. And that doesn't always happen with stories like we've talked about, and I know you know, but for that one, it was something I think I wanted to say. There's something about I think the responsibility that parents have and the hopes that they have for their kids and their ability to maybe get past some of the hindrances or the obstacles or the hangups that you have about yourself. I think the hope is that the next generation, without spoiling the story or where it goes or what the son character does or is not able to do, I'm going to keep it vague. Like you want your children to be able to do more than what you could, and you hope that you did everything for them as much as you could while you were able to. I think those are the two things that I'm always kind of wrestling with parent and child characters. So yeah, I know I can't say what that thing is for the final story. I think it's more or less clear, or the feeling is clear, if not the actual idea that like, you want the next generation to be able to bust through some of the just the frustrating uh obstacles that you feel as the previous generation.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that that generational kind of continuation of work is established pretty early on in that story.
Mhm.
And it's I mean, you talked about kind of the horror elements and the monsters earlier. Like it's a unsettling world to be a part of. And so
Right.
yeah, this idea that maybe you can set the next generation up for success in a way that you were not. Um, and I think that even ties back to what we touched on, like technology and like rapidly changing worlds and stuff. A lot of these stories take place in very kind of complex, uncertain situations.
Hmm.
And so even outside of families, this idea of just responsibility to the people around you and people that are coming after, like what are you leaving behind, seems to run through there a lot, and that too feels very contemporary.
For sure, for sure. And the only other thing I'll say about that, just really quick, because it didn't occur to me until you said that. I mean, again, as a parent, and this is what dominates the writing all the time, is, you're always thinking about how your choices impact your children, and especially how if you don't choose and you don't do anything and you freeze up, that in and of itself is a choice that has its own effects. So I think that's a big sort of generational theme that runs through all the stories, and especially the ending is, if you don't do anything, there are consequences for that as well.
Definitely. I'm gonna grab another question out of our chat here.
Yeah.
And as a writer, I know maybe that this doesn't have a good exact answer, but do you have a sense of how many stories you've written that didn't make the cut to go public in some fashion?
You know, cutting out everything I wrote when I was younger, like starting with like when I sat down and I wanted to be a writer and I tried really hard for it. I have a spreadsheet, so I could look it up. I have a feeling that there's half dozen stories or so that just never they're sitting in the trunk and I take them out every so often and dust them off and sometimes I'll sub them again, but I don't know if they'll see the light of day. And as time goes on, they get further and further away from what you're currently working on, so it doesn't feel right to
Hmm.
sub it anymore. So half dozen maybe is my guess. Yeah.
That's a good number. Yeah, it's funny. I know I broke out a trunk story the other day for a submission call. And
Ooh.
I did submit it, it got rejected, but reading through it too, and yeah, seeing however many years later it is, and just the fundamentally different feel of it from what I'm doing now.
Mhm.
I, I think to an extent it's fun to see the progress and like the growth as a creative to know like I've come this far, which isn't always evident in the moment.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also, I mean, it's fun to see the consistencies too, to like look back and be like, oh, like some of these ideas were already there, or these issues that I was focused on, they were already there in the beginning. Like, you don't always have to like hate on your past self and be like, I've come so far and this is my better self. Sometimes there are good things and nuggets you find in there, and you're like, oh, good for you, young version of me. Like, I'm glad you thought of that. Stuff like that. It is
Definitely, yeah. It's fun to find those notes and be like, this is a really good idea. Did I come up with this?
right, right.
Okay, we are winding down on time, so I've got one last question, which I ask at the end of all of these. We are writers and creators. We're also readers and audience.
Hmm.
So, what is one or a couple pieces of media? So it can be books, movies, music, anything, just that you've been loving lately.
Yeah, so I just picked up Sophia Samatar's collection Tender. And I had never read her before. I know like a lot of people rave about her writing, and I know that she's excellent. I just have never gotten around to it. And it's as great as people have said. I'm like blown away. It's funny too. This is gonna sound backhanded. I hope it's taken well or it's not like read in the wrong way, but like the formatting, like it's like a lot of it's not epistolary necessarily, but there are different formats that are played with that are not like straight storytelling formats and subject matters that are not like necessarily direct familial or nuclear families or whatever, more friendships and other distant relationships. Those are not my jam typically. For
Hmm.
whatever reason, I just don't click with those. But with her, it's just like it's like I feel like I've been tricked. I feel like I've like been lured out into deep water, and before I know it, I've drowned and I'm dead, and I didn't know what happened. That's how good it is. And I always love finding writers like that who like, despite my preconceptions or my like tastes, they end up overturning them and like sucking me in. And this is one of those collections, at least so far. I'm only, half a dozen stories in, but it's incredible. So that. And then in terms of other stuff, with three kids, video games have fallen away,
Hmm.
but Hades 2 has just coming out, and because it's designed, you can play it in just such short bursts. It's great for a chaotic schedule where you just put it down. So I've been working my way through that and enjoying it, at least so far, as much as the first one. So yeah, those two pieces of media are what are carrying me through right now.
Some great picks. I've never played the Hades games, but they're kind of on my radar because everyone I know that has played them loves them. So, uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another situation where it's like it's not my jam, like it's not my thing. I like RPGs or JRPGs, whatever, longer form, narrative driven. I don't like short burst games, but it is so well designed and it's so well put together, much like the Sophia Samatar collection. Like I just get sucked in and I play and it's addictive. So yeah, both of those things. Not what I would do normally, but they're fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm deep into another Baldur's Gate 3 run, which is
Mm.
very long form and time demanding. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I
um,
haven't had time for that one, but I know it's good. So
yeah,
maybe
it's definitely a commitment. Like it's very long form, but it's some incredible narrative storytelling mixed in there as well. Um, and I'll make one last pitch as we wind down. But I saw one battle after another in theaters, which
oh.
lots of folks have been talking about. And that kind of to tie off our conversation, that's an interesting one because there is so much going on in it, but rooted in all these kind of very conflicting, complicated, messy humans. So it's another one that like it very much grapples with the time we're in, but it's not like a singular message piece. Um, and I can see why it's getting all the acclaim it is because it is very relevant and very and told with a great deal of complexity. So
I bet. Yeah, I really want to see it. Just based off of the trailer, I know it's gonna be my jam. I know there's like intergenerational things and
Mhm.
poignant things, so I'm like, I cannot wait. But unfortunately, I haven't been in a theater in like 6, 7 years or however many years, so I gotta wait for it to be streaming. But whenever it is, I'm definitely gonna be watching that, I know.
Definitely, yeah. So I will wind down. Can you tell us anything that you are working on currently, and where can folks find you after we're done here?
Uh I was pretty spent. I was pretty like running on empty after the collection for a while. So I'm at a little bit of a lull and I gotta like pick back up my pace. But I'm all in it for the short fiction grind. So you'll probably see me, hopefully, knock on wood, because you never know. It's a roller coaster. But hopefully in some short fic magazines in the future. I will have a story coming out next year with Reactor Magazine, working with Anne Vandermeer, which I'm really excited about. But it's going to be that one takes a long time, so it's not going to be till end of 2026. But other than that, you can find my stuff at thomashallwrites.com. There's a bibliography there. You can find my latest stories and links to anything that's online. That's pretty much it. I'll be around.
Excellent. So yeah, we are at time. We will wind down, but thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen and anyone who comes to this video later. I know I selfishly love just getting to have these conversations, but it's always fun too that they resonate with other folks who tune in and get something out of this as well. And then also very much, Thomas, thank you for spending the evening with me. I've very much enjoyed this. I've said it, but like I adore this collection, and so getting to hear you just kind of talk about the process and what went into it is very fun. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to just talk endlessly and ramble and just talk shop. This is the fun stuff to do since we're usually by ourselves at our computers. Getting to actually talk to other writers, it's always a great blast. So thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. So yeah, stay tuned. I will have on my social channels updates on the next writers and readers live stream. I don't have a date yet, but there will be announcements coming for that once I get things scheduled. And have a great morning, evening, afternoon, everyone, depending on when you see this.